Dvořák in America. Question: what was the almost 52-year-old Bohemian-born and raised Dvořák, a chronic hypochondriac who hated to travel, who suffered from debilitating agoraphobia, an anxiety disorder in which the sufferer becomes anxious in environments that are unfamiliar, a man who was fearful of crowds and prone to performance anxiety and panic attacks? What was a guy like that doing conducting in front of 8,000 strangers in Chicago, 4,534 miles away from his home in Prague? It's a good question, and here is the answer. By 1891, at the age of 50, Dvořák was that rarest of living composers, successful, appreciated by a worldwide public, and relatively wealthy. Regarded by many as being the second greatest living composer after Johannes Brahms, the nationalist Czech accent with which Dvořák's music spoke made it, in fact, much more popular than Brahms's music. It was Dvořák's fame as a nationalist composer that made him a particularly desirable catch for a rich American woman named Jeanette Thurber. Mrs. Thurber was the wife of a wealthy wholesale grocer and was herself a musician of talent, having been educated at the Paris Conservatory. In Dvořák, Mrs. Thurber was not looking for a romantic catch. Rather, she was looking for a role model. I'll explain in a moment. But first, we need to know about Jeanette Thurber. She was one of the greatest patrons of music the United States has ever known. Had she given her name to any of the projects with which she was involved during her 96 years, she would be as well remembered today as Andrew Carnegie, Augustus D. Juilliard, George Eastman, and Avery Fisher. In 1885, Thurber personally founded the National Conservatory of Music in New York. It was modeled on the Paris Conservatory, and its avowed mission was to create a national musical spirit. The National Conservatory was the first great conservatory founded in New York City. Now, for our reference, New York's Institute of Musical Art was founded 19 years later, in 1904, and was renamed the Juilliard School in 1926. Thurber's National Conservatory folded in 1930 as a result of the stock market crash and the Depression, but it shed a bright light for 45 years, providing an affordable music education to 2 generations of deserving students, including African Americans and the handicapped. On June 5, 1891, Jeanette Thurber cabled Dvořák in Prague and offered him the directorship of the conservatory. The moment was auspicious, as the following year, 1892, marked the 400th anniversary of Columbus's first Atlantic crossing. At this celebratory moment in American history, Jeanette Thurber wanted Dvořák to help found, through his own example, an American school of composition at a time when almost every American composer wanted to sound like Brahms. The Dvořák scholar Michael Beckerman puts it this way, quote, "Dvořák was a ringer brought in to jumpstart American music," unquote. And Mrs. Thurber made Mr. Dvořák an offer he could not refuse. Come to New York, become the director of the conservatory, teach 3 hours a day, and put together some concerts. For this most modest schedule, the National Conservatory was prepared to pay dearly. Dvořák was offered a 3-year contract at a whopping $15,000 a year, a 2,500% increase over Dvořák's salary at the Prague Conservatory, and the equivalent today of around $405,000 a year. Dvořák took the job, though it's important to point out that he did not uproot himself from his beloved Prague and schlep to New York City just for the money. No, in truth, Dvořák was seduced by Jeanette Thurber's vision for American music. He was also in search of new inspiration, which he found big time in the New World. He was fascinated by the idea of America, a huge, sprawling, somewhat barbaric, energy-filled meritocracy in which his own working-class roots would be considered an asset rather than a liability. And so it was that on September 27th, 1892, Dvořák, his wife Anna, and his eldest son and daughter disembarked from the steamship Sala in Hoboken, New Jersey, just across the Hudson from New York City. Dvořák's arrival provoked a media frenzy, and no wonder. He was the first famous European composer to ever visit the United States. One of the first published descriptions of Dvořák appeared in the Musical Standard in October of 1892. Quote, "He is much taller than his pictures would imply and possesses not a tithe of the bulldog ferocity to be encountered in some of them. He is about 5'10" or 11 inches tall, a man of great natural dignity, a man of character. He is not beautiful in the forms of the face, but the lines of his brow are so finely modeled, and there is so much emotional life in the fiery eyes and lined face that his face is not easily forgotten," unquote. Yeah, for our information, Dvořák spoke passable English, which allowed him to communicate directly with his hosts. Within a few weeks of Dvořák's arrival, the Columbian Quadricentennial began. As such, he had a front row seat for one of the most sustained binges of Americana the nation had ever indulged. In December, 2 months after Dvořák's arrival, the well-known critic James Huneker wrote an article suggesting that a messiah of American music, yeah, guess who, should employ Negro melodies to create a new American style of music. For her part, Jeanette Thurber gave Dvořák a copy of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's epic poem, Song of Hiawatha, with the suggestion that he use it as the basis for what she called the Great American Opera. Well, Dvořák was swept up by all of this. An African-American faculty member at the National Conservatory named Henry Thacker Burley sang spirituals and plantation songs by Stephen Foster for Dvořák. Dvořák's not scientific by modern standards investigation into American culture took him to Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in the spring of 1893, where he heard and saw Oglala Sioux sing and dance. According to Michael Beckerman, quote, "With Jeanette Thurber working tirelessly to have Dvořák create a new American style and thus a new American school of music, he needed to select musical elements that would signify this American style," unquote. Dvořák's New World Symphony, composed in New York City between January 10th and May 24th of 1893, was the first of Dvořák's so-called American works. With its references to Negro spirituals, the plantation songs of Stephen Foster, and Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha, it has also been called the first great American symphony. Well, is it the first great American symphony? No, it's not. In reality, it is a cosmopolitan work, a combination of a German-styled symphony and tone poem with a very thin thematic veneer of Americanisms layered on top for local color. In a rare outburst, Dvořák refilled his peak with critics who attempted to paint him as an American composer, and I quote, "So, I am an American composer, am I? I was, I am, and I remain a Czech composer. I've only showed them, meaning the Americans, the path they might take, how they should work," unquote.